I didn't even understand what was happening before my knees gave out, sending me slamming onto the cold kitchen tile. The skillet hit the floor with a crash that seemed to shatter the very air, but it was the silence that followed. Mark's silence, his utter, terrifying lack of alarm that would claw at me long after the bruises faded. My namesake is Claire, and that fall wasn't just physical. It was the moment everything I thought I knew about my life imploded. 1 second, I was stirring pasta sauce, the comforting scent of garlic and tomatoes warming my suburban kitchen. The next, the world didn't just tilt. It dissolved into a suffocating, inky blackness. My legs buckled, a sudden, complete betrayal, and I sprawled, breathless, across the worn linoleum. I lay there, gasping, my body a leaden weight I couldn't command, couldn't even twitch. My husband, Mark, stood just a few feet away, watching. His face was a blank slate, devoid of alarm, devoid of anything resembling concern. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. Instead, he simply looked down, his voice a chilling monotone that somehow cut deeper than any impact. Asterisk. The floor suits you, Claire. The words, not the fall, sent a searing humiliation through me, blurring my vision. It felt like an eternity before the sterile white walls of the emergency room replaced the phantom warmth of my kitchen. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, harsh and unforgiving. The relentless, rhythmic beeping of machines formed the soundtrack to my fear. Mark was there too, a silent sentinel by the door, arms crossed, his posture a solid wall between us. The doctor held my chart, his brow furrowed as he scanned the pages. His gaze moved from the chart to me, to Mark, and back again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Asterisk, it stretched agonizingly as if time itself had gone rigid with dread. Asterisk, then, with a deliberate, almost surgical precision, the doctor set the chart down on the counter. He pulled a small penlight from his coat pocket, stepped toward me, and angled it briefly across my eyes. Whatever he saw there made him pause. He clicked the light off, tucked it away, then turned to Mark with a particular brand of professional courtesy that held something harder underneath. Asterisk, mister. Harmon, he said, his voice measured, almost gentle. Asterisk, would you mind stepping into the hallway for just a moment? Mark didn't move immediately. His eyes traveled from the doctor to me and back. A slow, deliberate sweep, as though he were calculating an unseen equation. Then, the wall of his posture shifted, barely, just enough, and he unfolded his arms, pushed off the doorframe, and walked out without a word. The door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. The doctor waited 3 full seconds before he spoke again. When he turned back to me, the clinical courtesy was still in his face, but beneath it now was something else. Something careful, direct, and utterly empathetic, which landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Asterisk, Claire, he said quietly. Asterisk, I want you to know that nothing you tell me leaves this room without your permission. I nodded, though my throat had closed around whatever answer I might have given. He glanced once at the door. It was such a small question, but it cracked something open in my chest that I hadn't realized had been sealed shut. And in that crack, in the space between his words and my silence, the unraveling truly began. My alarm clock, a tyrant disguised as a chirping bird, went off at 5:47. Not 5:45, not 6, but 5:47. Because that was the only 13-minute window where I could shower before Lily woke up and still have coffee ready before Mark came downstairs, expecting it. My entire existence, I would later understand, had been calibrated around these agonizing increments. I stood at the counter that morning, watching the coffee drip, the smell doing nothing to wake me. I thought, not for the first time, that I couldn't quite recall what it felt like to wake up rested. Not tired but okay. Actually rested. The kind where you open your eyes and your first thought isn't already a crushing list. It had been years since I'd had that. My days had a shape, and that shape had a weight. Always up first. 2 lunches packed, 1 for Lily, 1 for Mark, because somewhere along the way that had become my sole responsibility. Emails answered from my desk in the living room corner, while simultaneously unloading the dishwasher. Carpool. Dentist appointments. Mark's dry cleaning, forgotten for 11 days, picked up without a word because mentioning it would start something I didn't have the energy to finish. Evenings, I cooked. Weekends, I cleaned gutters, folded laundry, helped with homework. Somewhere in the spaces between, I tried to be a person. The headaches had started about 8 months before. Dull at first, a persistent pressure behind my left eye that I blamed on screen light, the changing weather, dehydration. I bought a giant water bottle, set reminders. The headaches stayed. Then came the dizziness, brief, unsettling spells where the room would tip slightly, like a boat shifting on choppy water. I gripped countertops until my knuckles ached. I sat down in grocery store aisles and pretended to read labels, my world swaying. Once, the highway itself seemed to breathe, forcing me to pull over for 4 minutes. I sat there, both hands clenched on the wheel, engine still running, watching the hazard lights tick on and off against the guardrail, waiting for the world to decide to hold still. It did, eventually. I pulled back onto the highway and told no one. I mentioned it to Mark once. He was scrolling through his phone, a familiar blue glow on his face. He didn't look up when he said, "You just stress yourself out, Claire." I called about the water heater. The worst part wasn't the dismissal. The worst part was that I had heard it so many times from so many directions that his voice had stopped being his voice at all. It had become mine. "You're being dramatic. You're tired, that's all. Everyone is tired." So I pushed through. I pushed through the headaches and the dizzy spells and the mornings when my hands trembled slightly as I poured the coffee. I pushed through the hollow feeling that had taken up permanent residence in my chest, a constant, dull ache. I told myself, this is just life. But a body doesn't send the same signal 100 times because it expects to be ignored. It escalates. It finds new languages. It gets louder and louder until the only thing left to say it says all at once. Mine had been saying it for months, in trembling hands and tilting rooms, and that 4-minute stop on the highway when I gripped the steering wheel, waiting for the world to hold still. And I had answered every single one of those messages the same way. Not now. Later. There was one moment I kept coming back to, even then. About 3 weeks before that night, I had been sitting at my desk in the corner of the living room, same emails, same half-unloaded dishwasher, when the pressure behind my left eye spiked so sharply that I actually gasped. Not a quiet intake of breath. A sound. Lily had looked up from the couch where she was doing homework and said, "Mom?" And I had smiled and said, "Just a headache, baby." She had watched me for a moment longer than a 9-year-old should have to, and then she looked back down at her worksheet. I filed that look away somewhere I didn't intend to open again. I was getting good at that, at storing things in places I pretended didn't exist. The highway. The grocery store aisle. The gasped breath in a quiet room. Each one sealed and shelved, a cabinet I told myself I'd deal with later. Later never came on my terms. Until the night the kitchen floor caught me. And for the first time in 6 years, I had nowhere left to be. Doctor. Reyes pulled his chair close to my bed before he spoke. And I would later understand that's what they do when the news requires sitting down. His name was Dr. Reyes. I remember the small silver name tag pinned to his white coat, slightly crooked. And then he told me, multiple sclerosis. Relapsing, remitting, likely progressing. The MRI showed lesions. He used that word, lesions, like small, insidious fires burning quietly through the intricate geography of my brain and spine while I was packing lunches, scheduling dentist appointments, and picking up dry cleaning that wasn't even mine. The room didn't spin. It went perfectly, terrifyingly still. I heard the words IDS, and then I heard nothing but a deafening hum, and then I heard everything at once. The buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant beep of a monitor down the hall, the frantic, shallow sound of my own breathing echoing too loud inside my own head. Not even a question, just 2 useless words hanging in the air. What happens now? What does this mean? Will I? I couldn't finish that one. I pressed my lips together and stared at the ceiling tile, the one with a small water stain shaped vaguely like a bird, and I focused on that stain because if I looked at Dr. Reyes, I would come completely apart. Mark spoke first. His voice had that particular tone, the one he used when something inconvenienced him, but he was trying, oh so valiantly, to sound reasonable. Asterisk, people live normal lives with that. Doctor. Reyes looked at him steadily. Asterisk, it's a serious chronic condition. It will require significant lifestyle adjustments and ongoing treatment. Mark cut him off, a definitive conclusion, like he was closing a bothersome tab on his mental browser. Asterisk, that's basically what causes these things to flare up, isn't it? She runs herself ragged. I turned my head slowly and looked at my husband. He was standing near the window, arms crossed, always that same posture, that same impenetrable fortress of arms, nodding slightly, as though he had just diagnosed something correctly. As though I had somehow done this to myself. I looked back at the ceiling stain. The bird. Still there. Doctor. Reyes continued, something about neurology referrals and medication and follow-up appointments, and I nodded at the right moments because that was what I did. I performed functionality even when I was dissolving. He paused once, looked directly at me rather than at Mark, and said, Asterisk, do you have questions, Claire? Any at all. It was such a small thing. Being asked. Being the one addressed in the room that was entirely about my body, my future, my life narrowing or not narrowing, depending on variables no one could yet predict. I almost said, will I still be able to drive? To work? Doctor. Reyes nodded. He set a card on the bedside table, the neurology referral I assumed, and said he would give us some time. That he'd be back to answer anything. He meant it. I could tell he meant it. The door closed behind him with a soft, careful click. Mark exhaled, the exhale of a man recalibrating a schedule. Asterisk, he said. Asterisk so. We'll figure this out. I was still staring at the ceiling. At the bird-shaped stain. I said nothing. And I was waiting with every fragile cell in my body for Mark to cross the room. To sit on the edge of the bed. To take my hand in both of his the way he had, once, a very long time ago, when I'd cried over something smaller, and he had still believed that my crying was something he was responsible for tending. He didn't move from the window. He checked his phone instead. Just a glance. A small private glance he thought I didn't see. I saw it. And in that gap between what I needed and what he chose, something in me stopped waiting. Not dramatically, with a crash or a sob. The way a candle goes out in an empty room. No witness, no sound, just the absence of light where light had been. I kept staring at the bird on the ceiling. I thought, I am going to have to learn how to survive this without him. And I think I already knew that. The thought arrived fully formed, the way the truest thoughts do, not as a decision, but as a recognition. Something I had already known, finally saying its name. I reached over and picked up the card Dr. Reyes had left on the bedside table. I didn't read it yet. I just held it, the small, clean rectangle of it pressed between my fingers, because it was the one thing in that room given directly to me, meant for no one else. A next step that was mine to take. Mark was still at the window. I curled my hand around the card and looked back at the ceiling. The bird. Still there. The night I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself, my husband was 20 feet away watching television, and I understood, finally, that no one was coming. Not for me. Not in this house. The weeks after the diagnosis moved differently than time had before. Not slower, exactly. More like thicker. Like wading through invisible treacle that pressed against my ribs constantly, a weight that had no name but consumed all my energy. Doctor. Reyes referred me to a neurologist named Dr. Anand, who was kind and precise and used a whiteboard to explain things, which I appreciated because my brain, increasingly unreliable, needed pictures more than words those days. We started a medication, interferon injections, 3 times a week. I learned to do them myself. I sat on the edge of the bathtub at night with a small orange needle, feeling the cold sting, and I told myself it was just another task. Just another thing on the list. But the list had changed shape entirely. Instead of dentist appointments and dry cleaning, it was injection nights, fatigue management, avoiding heat because heat made the symptoms, spiral, resting, actually resting, in the middle of the afternoon like my body demanded, sometimes desperately. I started dropping things. Not always, but enough. A coffee mug one morning shattering on the tile. A handful of Lily's crayons another time, scattering across the rug. And once, horribly, I didn't fall to the kitchen floor. I simply sat down because I could not stand for one more second. I needed to be low to the ground where nothing else could hurt me further. I was 34 years old and I was learning the geography of my own limitations like a country I had never asked to live in. My name is Claire, and I had spent 6 years being useful, and now I was learning to be something I had no language for yet. Mark did not adjust. That is the cleanest, most brutally honest way I can say it. He did not adjust. As though my illness was a scheduling conflict, a minor administrative headache for him. As though I had inconvenienced the entire household by acquiring a neurological condition. I stopped asking. That was how it worked with us. I would need something, receive nothing, and quietly reroute. I had been doing it so long it felt like breathing. Except now the rerouting cost me more than I had. I was paying with currency I no longer possessed, and the debt was mounting somewhere I couldn't see but could absolutely feel. One night in November, a Tuesday, unremarkable, cold in the particular way that Ohio November is cold, I stood in the bathroom after my injection and looked in the mirror for a long time. My eyes were the thing that stopped me. I knew my face. I had lived in it for 34 years. But the woman looking back at me had eyes that were empty is not quite the right word. Like someone who had been trying to signal for help from a very long distance and had finally, irrevocably, put the lamp down. Not Mark. Not anyone who was supposed to already be here, already be fighting alongside me. I don't know how long I stood like that. Long enough for the bathroom tile to send cold up through my feet. Long enough for the television sounds to drift under the door, laugh track, then a commercial, then silence. And for me to understand, in a way I had been circling for months without landing, that this was not a difficult season. This was just my life. This was what had been decided for me. Incrementally, quietly, in 1,000 small moments where I had asked for something and received nothing, and told myself it was fine. It was not fine. And I knew, standing there, that Lily had watched me ask and receive nothing too. Children notice. They catalog. I had told myself I was protecting her by staying steady, by rerouting, by keeping the household running on the fuel of my own erasure. But what she was actually learning, in those small accumulated smsments, was what a woman was supposed to accept. What love was supposed to look like. I could not keep teaching her that. And then something else. Small. Quiet. Like a single match struck in a very dark room. I was still here, tired and diminished, and holding an empty syringe in a cold bathroom while my husband watched television 20 feet away. But I was still here. My legs had buckled. My hands had dropped things. My body had been mapped and diagnosed and charted on someone else's whiteboard. And still I had gotten up every morning and given my daughter breakfast and managed the injections and carried the weight of a household that had never once offered to carry me back. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. I set the syringe down on the edge of the sink. I looked at the woman in the mirror, at Claire, who had collapsed and been dismissed and diagnosed and minimized and left standing alone in every room that was supposed to hold her. And something solidified in my chest. Not rage. Not yet. Something quieter than rage and far more dangerous. A decision. I was going to fight. Not for the marriage, not for the version of myself that had calibrated her entire existence around someone else's comfort. not for anyone's approval or convenience or careful, deliberate blindness. For me, for Lily, for the life I had been too exhausted and too erased to realize I still deserved, and the life I still had time to show her was possible. I didn't know yet what that would look like. I didn't have a plan. I had only that small, stubborn flame, barely a flicker, pressing against the inside of my ribs where the heaviness had lived for so long. But I had learned, sitting on the kitchen floor in my wool socks because my body had simply refused to pretend anymore, that the body does not lie. It had been telling me the truth for years. About the fatigue. About the loneliness. About the slow, steady cost of disappearing inside a life that was never quite built for you. I had finally stopped arguing with it. And my body, in return, was telling me to choose myself. Not tomorrow. Not when things got easier, or when someone finally noticed, or when I had gathered enough evidence to justify it. Now. Here. In this cold bathroom, with the television murmuring behind the door and my reflection watching me with eyes that were not finished after all, just waiting. I still told myself it was just stress. I told myself that for 3 more years. That was the first lie I had to stop telling. The first call I made wasn't easy. It was to a therapist named Dr. Patricia Walsh, whose name I'd found on a pamphlet in Dr. Anand's waiting room, folded into my coat pocket 3 weeks before I ever worked up the nerve to dial. Her voicemail was warm. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. I called on a Wednesday morning while Lily was at school and Mark was at work, sitting cross-legged on the bathroom floor with the door locked, the only room in the house that was fully, reliably mine. I left a message. My voice shook a little. I didn't apologize for it. Patricia called back within the hour. 6 words. I had apparently needed someone to say them for years. The changes didn't come all at once. They came like the slow, inexorable thaw of something frozen very deep, imperceptible most days, and then suddenly, undeniably, breaking free. I started sleeping when my body asked me to, even if it was 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday with dishes still in the sink. I started eating actual meals instead of whatever I could assemble standing up in 30 seconds. I found a gentle yoga class at a studio 12 minutes from the house, taught by a woman named Grace, who never once told me to push harder. The first day, I cried in child's pose, and she simply put her hand briefly on my shoulder blade and moved on, which was exactly the right thing to do. I started saying no. Not dramatically. Not with speeches. Just no. I can't do that this week. That doesn't work for me. Each small no felt like using a muscle that had atrophied from decades of disuse. Uncomfortable and strange. And sometimes the look on people's faces, the mild surprise, the recalibration, made me want to immediately take it back. I didn't take it back. The conversation with Mark happened on a Sunday in February, gray and still, Lily at her grandmother's for the weekend. I had rehearsed nothing. He looked at me for a long moment, a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years, surprise, perhaps. Asterisk, you're serious, he said. Not a question. Already reframing, already building his convenient version. Asterisk, because of everything that happened before the diagnosis, I said, my voice steady. He didn't yell. In some ways that was harder, the absence of fire, the way he went quiet, and then simply stood up and walked to the other room, as though I had raised a minor administrative concern that required processing elsewhere. I sat at the table alone and waited for regret to arrive. It didn't come. What came instead was a feeling I didn't have a name for at first. Not relief exactly, not triumph. Something quieter. The sensation of a massive door I had been pressing my full weight against for years, finally opening and finding I could stand on my own. What followed was slow and uneven, and nothing like the clean recovery arc I had imagined. But it resembled in pieces, imperfectly, a life. A small apartment, 30 minutes from Lily's school, with south-facing windows, I filled with plants I remembered to water. A shared custody arrangement that gave me every other week to sleep uninterrupted and wake without bracing for what the silence would cost me. A group, Women with Chronic Illness, found through Dr. Anand's office, who met on the first Thursday of every month at a community center that smelled like coffee and old carpet, and who understood, without my having to explain, why fatigue is not laziness and pain is not performance. My friend Jess, who had texted me 14 times during the worst months and received 14 non-answers, came over the first Saturday I had the apartment to myself and brought wine I couldn't drink anymore and Thai food I absolutely could. I had to put my fork down for a moment. Still in there. Yes. Still here. The Post-it was still in my coat pocket. I had taken it with me when I packed. I pressed it onto the inside of the new medicine cabinet the night Jess left, in a bathroom that was mine without having to lock the door. There were bad days. I want to be honest about that because the story where everything turns cleanly after one decision isn't mine, and it isn't real. There were days the fatigue pinned me flat, and I lay in bed watching the ceiling and felt the full weight of everything I had lost. The marriage I had tried so hard to salvage. The version of my body that had never needed a syringe 3 times a week. The years I had spent making myself small for someone who never once noticed the effort. There were days I called Patricia from the parking lot of the grocery store because I couldn't go in, couldn't face the lights and the noise and the performance of being fine. There were days I looked at Lily, her brown eyes, her absolute certainty that I was the most capable person in any room, and felt the terror of being someone's anchor when the water keeps rising. On one of those days, I told Patricia exactly that, sitting in her office with my hands wrapped around a paper cup of water that had gone cold. She didn't offer me reassurance. She asked me what I thought Lily actually needed from me. Not performance, I said, after a long silence. Just presence. Patricia nodded. Asterisk that you can give her, she said. I wrote that down too. A different Post-it. Same cabinet. There were days I still felt the pull of the old reflex, the urge to make myself smaller, quieter, less inconvenient. And I had to stand at that medicine cabinet and read both notes before I could move through the morning. But I got up. Every time I got up. Not because I was strong in the way people mean when they call someone strong, stoic, unbothered, made of something harder than ordinary material. I got up because the alternative was a life I had already been living, and I had finally seen it clearly enough to know I could not go back. There are days I still feel like I've stumbled backward further than I've come. But when I look at where I'm standing now, in these south-facing windows, in this imperfect quiet, in this body I am finally learning to care for instead of override, I see a version of myself I didn't know existed. She was always there. She just needed someone to finally choose her. It was a Tuesday. I was standing at the bathroom sink, holding an empty syringe, the tiny plastic cap still warm from my touch. I stared at my reflection, and the quiet truth hit me like a physical blow. I could not remember the last time anyone had asked me how I was doing, and meant it. Not my husband. Not my doctor. Not a single person in the house I had spent years holding together. I was 33 years old. I had multiple sclerosis. And I had just collapsed on the kitchen floor while dinner was still on the stove, and been told, before I had even stopped shaking, to get up and finish cooking. Asterisk because I waited a very long time. And I almost ran out of time to stop waiting. It has been almost a year since that bathroom. Since that syringe. Since the quietest, most consequential decision of my life. I wake up in the morning and the first thing I do is lie still for a moment. Not with a schedule, not with a list of everything I need to do for everyone else. With myself. With my body, the one that has been trying to tell me the truth for years, and which I am finally learning to hear. My name is Claire. I am 34 years old. I have multiple sclerosis, and I am not collapsing under the weight of someone else's indifference anymore. Most mornings I make coffee slowly. I open the back door and let the cold air in. That Ohio cold I used to dread now just feels honest, real. Nora stays with me 3 nights a week, and on those mornings I make her eggs the way she likes them, edges a little crispy. We sit at the table without rushing, sometimes without saying much at all. It is the most ordinary, extraordinary thing. Diane calls on Sundays. Rosarvia's group meets on Thursdays. Doctor. Osmond sees me every 3 months and still looks at me like a person worth understanding. These are not grand things, but they are mine. I think about the woman I was, invisible in her own kitchen, collapsing and being told to get up and finish cooking dinner. I don't feel anger when I think about her now. I feel grief and then something closer to love. She was doing the only thing she knew how to do. She just hadn't been taught yet that trying for herself was allowed. And here is what I need you to hear. Asterisk, your body is not dramatic. It is not weak. Asterisk, when it stumbles, when it puts you on the floor, it is not failing you. It is speaking to you in the only language left when everything else has been ignored. Asterisk, you do not need to earn the right to matter. Asterisk, start now. One small thing. A phone call you've been putting off. A truth you've been swallowing. A door cracked open just enough to let a little cold, honest air in. I know how tired you are. I know how long you've been holding everything together while quietly coming apart. But you are still here. Asterisk, and still here is not the consolation prize. Asterisk,